I discovered the construction crew on my property on a Tuesday morning in July, when I was supposed to be 300 miles away in Charlotte attending a sales conference. My name is Quentin Eldridge, and I had owned the 5-acre parcel on the edge of Asheville, North Carolina for nearly 8 years. The land was my retirement dream, a wooded lot with a creek running through it where I planned to eventually build a proper house and escape the chaos of sales management. For now, I lived in a modest townhouse closer to downtown, but I visited my land every few weekends to clear trails and plan for the future. The property was pristine, untouched except for a small clearing I had made near the access road. The conference had been canceled at the last minute due to the keynote speaker having a medical emergency. So, I decided to head out to my land instead of wasting a perfectly good vacation day. I pulled up the gravel access road around 10 in the morning and immediately heard the rumble of heavy machinery. My stomach dropped. I accelerated, branches scraping against my truck as I rushed forward, and then I saw it. A massive excavator sat in the middle of my clearing, its bucket tearing into the earth. 2 dump trucks idled nearby, and at least a dozen workers in hard hats moved around what was clearly the foundation of a substantial building. Orange construction fencing surrounded the entire area, and a large sign proclaimed future site of Pinecrest HOA Community Clubhouse grand opening September 15th. I slammed on my brakes and jumped out of my truck, my heart pounding. A man in a white hard hat and reflective vest walked toward me, clipboard in hand. "Sir, this is a construction site. You cannot be here without proper safety equipment," he said, holding up a hand. "This is my property," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "What the hell are you doing on my land?" The man's expression shifted from annoyed to confused. "Your property. This is Pinecrest HOA land. We have all the permits." "Show me," I demanded. He flipped through papers on his clipboard and showed me a building permit. The address listed was 1847 Mountain Laurel Way, which was indeed my property address. But the owner listed was Pinecrest Home Owners Association. "There has been a massive mistake," I said. "I am Quentin Eldridge and I own this land. I have the deed in my truck." The foreman's face paled. "Hold on. Let me call the project manager." I stood there watching workers continue to dig and pour concrete while the foreman made frantic phone calls. My mind raced through possibilities. This had to be some kind of administrative error, maybe a mix-up with lot numbers or addresses. Pinecrest was a development about half a mile down the road, a sprawling subdivision of cookie-cutter houses that had been built 5 years ago. I had watched it go up with mild annoyance, as it had increased traffic on what used to be a quiet rural road, but it had nothing to do with me or my property. 20 minutes later, a silver Mercedes SUV pulled up, and out stepped a woman who could only be described as the physical embodiment of entitlement. She was probably in her mid-50s, with an aggressive blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, and a pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She marched over with the confidence of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. "I am Patricia Whitmore, president of the Pinecrest Home Owners Association," she announced. "What seems to be the problem here?" "The problem is that you are building on my land without my permission," I said, trying to keep my voice level. Patricia looked at me like I was a child who had just claimed the moon belonged to him. "This land was purchased by the HOA 6 months ago as part of our community expansion project. We have all the legal documentation." "That is impossible because I never sold you anything," I said. "I have owned this property since 2018, and I have never been contacted by your HOA or anyone else about selling it." Patricia's expression tightened. Then there must be some confusion on your part. Perhaps you are thinking of a different property. I walked back to my truck and retrieved my folder of property documents. My hands were shaking as I pulled out the deed, property tax receipts, and survey maps. I shoved them toward Patricia. "This is my deed, recorded with Buncombe County. These are my tax payments, all up to date. This is my land, and you are trespassing." Patricia barely glanced at the documents. "I will have our attorney review this, but I can assure you that we have legal ownership of this parcel. Construction will continue." "The hell it will," I said. "I want everyone off my property right now, or I am calling the police." Patricia pulled out her phone. "Be my guest. I will call them myself, and we can sort this out with law enforcement present." Within 15 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies arrived. I explained the situation to them, showing my documentation. Patricia produced a folder from her Mercedes with what she claimed was the HOA's deed to the property. The deputies examined both sets of documents, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "This is a civil matter," the older deputy finally said. "You both have documents claiming ownership. We cannot force anyone off the property without a court order. You need to resolve this through the legal system." "So they can just keep building on my land?" I asked, incredulous. "We cannot stop permitted construction based on a property dispute without a judge's order," the deputy said. "You need to file an emergency injunction." Patricia had a satisfied smile on her face. "I suggest you contact an attorney, Mr. Eldridge. But I can tell you right now that you are wasting your time and money. This land belongs to Pinecrest HOA, and our clubhouse will open as scheduled on September 15th. I spent the rest of that day in a fog of rage and disbelief. I drove straight to the Buncombe County Register of Deeds office. The clerk helped me pull up the property records, and what I found made my blood run cold. 6 months ago, a deed had been recorded transferring my property from Quentin Eldridge to Pinecrest Home Owners Association for the sum of $185,000. The deed included a notarized signature that was supposed to be mine, except I had never signed any such document. I had never been offered $185,000 or any amount of money for my land. I had never met with anyone from the HOA or a title company about a sale. The signature on the deed looked vaguely like mine, but it was not quite right. Someone had forged my signature. "This is fraud," I told the clerk. "I never signed this deed." She looked uncomfortable. "You need to speak with an attorney and possibly the police. If you believe a document was fraudulently recorded, you can file a claim to have it voided, but that requires legal action." I left the county building and immediately called the only attorney I knew personally, a guy named Marcus who had helped me with my will a few years back. He did not handle real estate litigation, but he gave me the name of someone who did. Jennifer Coates, who apparently had a reputation as a bulldog in property disputes. I called her office and, by some miracle, had an appointment that same afternoon at 4. Her office was in a renovated Victorian house near downtown Asheville, all hardwood floors and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. Jennifer Coates was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. I laid out everything for her, showing her my original deed, the fraudulent deed, and photos I had taken of the construction on my property. She listened carefully, making notes. "This is definitely fraud," she said when I finished. "The question is who committed it and how they managed to get it recorded. Do you have any idea how they might have obtained your personal information or a copy of your signature?" I thought about it. "I had some documents stolen from my truck about 8 months ago. I was at a Home Depot, and when I came out, my glove compartment had been rifled through. I did not think much of it at the time because my insurance cards were still there, and I figured it was just someone looking for cash or electronics. What documents were in the glove compartment? Jennifer asked. Registration, some old maintenance records, and I think I had a copy of my property deed in there because I had been meeting with a surveyor earlier that week about marking boundaries. Jennifer nodded grimly. That would explain how they got a copy of your signature and your property information. They probably hired someone to forge your signature on the deed, had it notarized by a corrupt or careless notary, and then recorded it with the county before you had any idea what was happening. How is that even possible? I asked. Do they not verify these things? The Register of Deeds records documents that appear to be properly notarized and formatted, Jennifer explained. They do not independently verify that every signature is genuine. That would be impossible. The system relies on the assumption that notaries are doing their job and that people are not committing fraud. So what do I do now? First, we file an emergency motion for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction to stop construction immediately. We will need to do that tomorrow morning. Second, we file a lawsuit to quiet title, which is a legal action to determine the rightful owner of the property. Third, you need to file a police report for fraud and forgery. This is a serious crime, and whoever did this needs to be prosecuted. How long will this take? I asked. Jennifer hesitated. Property litigation can take months, sometimes over a year. But given that construction is actively happening, a judge should hear our motion for the injunction within a few days. If we can prove fraud, which seems likely based on what you have shown me, we should be able to stop construction and eventually get your property back. They said they are having a grand opening on September 15th, I said. That is less than 2 months away. We will do everything we can to stop this, Jennifer assured me. But I need you to be prepared for this to be a long and expensive fight. Property litigation is not cheap. I left her office feeling overwhelmed, but at least like I had a plan. That evening, I filed a police report with the Asheville Police Department. The detective who took my statement, a tired-looking man named Detective Raymond Santos, seemed interested, but also warned me that these cases were difficult to prosecute. Property fraud schemes are becoming more common, he said. Scammers will forge deeds and try to sell property they do not own, or in your case, transfer it to an entity they control. We will investigate, but these things take time. You think the HOA is involved in the fraud? I asked. I cannot speculate, Detective Santos said. It is possible someone defrauded both you and the HOA. The HOA might think they legitimately purchased the property, or they might be complicit. We will have to follow the evidence. Over the next 3 days, Jennifer worked around the clock to prepare our motion. We filed it on Friday morning, and the judge scheduled an emergency hearing for Monday afternoon. In the meantime, construction continued on my property. Every day I drove out there and watched my clearing being transformed into a construction site. The foundation was completed, and they had started framing the building. It was going to be huge, probably 5,000 square feet, with what looked like plans for a pool and tennis courts nearby. I took photos and videos of everything, documenting the trespass. I also started doing research on Patricia Whitmore and the Pinecrest HOA. What I found was troubling. Online reviews from Pinecrest residents painted a picture of an HOA board that was tyrannical and possibly corrupt. There were complaints about arbitrary fines, selective enforcement of rules, and questionable financial management. Several residents had sued the HOA over various issues, though most of those cases had been settled out of court. Patricia Whitmore herself had a history. Before moving to Asheville, she had been president of an HOA in a suburb of Atlanta that had been investigated for financial irregularities. No charges had been filed, but the HOA had been forced to hire an independent auditor after residents complained about missing funds. Monday came, and Jennifer and I arrived at the Buncombe County Courthouse at 1:30 for our 2 o'clock hearing. Patricia Whitmore was there with an attorney, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit named Gordon Fletcher. We all filed into the courtroom, and Judge Margaret Henson took the bench. Jennifer presented our case efficiently, showing the judge my original deed, the fraudulent deed, and documentation of the construction. She argued that there was clear evidence of fraud, and that irreparable harm was being done to my property while we sorted out the legal ownership. Gordon Fletcher argued that the HOA had purchased the property in good faith, had no knowledge of any fraud, and had already invested over $200,000 in the construction project. He claimed that stopping construction would cause significant financial harm to the HOA and its members. Judge Henson listened to both sides and then examined the documents carefully. After about 15 minutes, she looked up. "Mr. Fletcher, the deed your client is relying on has a notarization date of January 15th, 2026. According to the notary registry, the notary public listed on that document, Susan Chambers, had her license expired since December 2025 and did not renew it until March 2026. That means this document was allegedly notarized by someone who was not a valid notary at the time." Fletcher's face went pale. He flipped through his papers frantically. "Your Honor, I was not aware of that issue. We will need to investigate." Furthermore, Judge Henson continued, Mr. Eldridge has presented substantial evidence that he never consented to this transfer and has continuously owned and paid taxes on this property. The signature on the deed your client is relying on appears questionable at best. I am granting the temporary restraining order. All construction on the property located at 1847 Mountain Laurel Way is to cease immediately pending resolution of this matter. We will schedule a full hearing on the preliminary injunction in 2 weeks. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Jennifer squeezed my arm briefly, a small smile on her face. Patricia Whitmore looked furious. As we left the courtroom, she cornered me in the hallway. "You are making a huge mistake," she hissed. "We purchased that land legally. You will regret dragging this out." "Stay off my property," I said coldly. Over the next 2 weeks, things escalated. Despite the restraining order, I drove by my property several times and noticed that work had not entirely stopped. While major construction had ceased, there were workers on site doing what they claimed was securing the construction site, but which looked suspiciously like continued work. I documented everything and reported it to Jennifer, who filed a motion for contempt of court. Meanwhile, Detective Santos had been investigating. He called me on a Wednesday afternoon about 10 days after the hearing. "We located the notary, Susan Chambers," he said. "She claims she never notarized any deed for you or for Pinecrest HOA. Her notary stamp was stolen from her car in December 2025, and she reported it to the police at the time. Someone used her stolen stamp to notarize the fraudulent deed." "So it is definitely fraud," I said. "Yes. We are also looking into the HOA's finances and how they supposedly paid for the property. We have subpoenaed their bank records. You think Patricia Whitmore is involved? I cannot comment on an ongoing investigation," Detective Santos said. "But I can tell you that we are looking very closely at everyone who had a role in this transaction." The preliminary injunction hearing happened on a Thursday in early August. This time, there was more at stake. If the judge granted the preliminary injunction, construction would remain stopped until the entire case was resolved, which could take months. If the judge denied it, the HOA could continue building. Jennifer had spent the 2 weeks gathering more evidence. She had hired a forensic document examiner who testified that the signature on the fraudulent deed was a forgery. She had subpoenaed the title company that supposedly handled the transaction and discovered that the closer who allegedly processed the sale had never worked for that company. It was completely fabricated. Gordon Fletcher put up a weaker defense this time. He tried to argue that the HOA was an innocent victim of fraud, just like me, and should not be punished for someone else's crime. But Judge Henson was not buying it. "Mr. Fletcher, your client never contacted Mr. Eldridge before beginning construction on what they claimed was their property. They never sent a letter, never made a phone call, never knocked on his door. That is not how innocent parties behave. An innocent purchaser would have done due diligence and reached out to the previous owner to coordinate the transfer. The fact that your client immediately began construction suggests they knew exactly what they were doing." Fletcher tried to sputter a response, but Judge Henson cut him off. "I am granting the preliminary injunction. Construction will remain stopped until this case is fully adjudicated. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. This appears to be a clear case of fraud and forgery." Patricia Whitmore stormed out of the courtroom, her face bright red. As Jennifer and I walked to our cars, she seemed cautiously optimistic. "This is good," she said. "The criminal investigation will help our civil case. If charges are filed, it will be much easier to prove fraud and get the fraudulent deed voided." "How long until this is resolved?" I asked. "Could be 6 months, could be longer, but we are in a good position." I drove home feeling better than I had in weeks, but also exhausted. This fight was taking a toll on me. I was spending thousands of dollars on legal fees, losing sleep, and constantly stressed. But there was no way I was going to let someone steal my land. In late August, Detective Santos called with significant news. "We have arrested Patricia Whitmore and 2 members of the HOA board, Kenneth Fuller and Deanne Morrison. They have been charged with fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit theft." "What did you find?" I asked. "It is a complicated scheme," Detective Santos explained. "Basically, Whitmore wanted to build the clubhouse, but the HOA did not have enough money, and there was no suitable land within the Pinecrest development. She identified your property as ideal because it was adjacent to the neighborhood, and you were an absentee owner who only visited occasionally. She hired someone to steal documents from your truck, then paid a forger to create the deed. They used HOA funds to pay the forger and to create fake transaction records. The plan was to build the clubhouse, claim it had always been HOA property if anyone asked, and by the time you noticed, it would be too late to do anything about it." "That is insane," I said. "Did they really think they would get away with it?" "Fraud like this works more often than you would think," Detective Santos said. "If you had not shown up when you did, if the conference had not been canceled, they might have completed the entire building before you noticed. At that point, even with proof it was your land, it would have been much harder to get them to tear down a finished building. They were counting on the courts being reluctant to order demolition of a completed structure. The criminal charges changed everything." Gordon Fletcher withdrew as the HOA's attorney, presumably not wanting to be associated with a criminal case. The new attorney the HOA hired immediately reached out to Jennifer about settling. "They are offering to deed the property back to you and pay for restoration of the land to its original condition," Jennifer told me over the phone. "They will also pay your attorney fees and give you $50,000 for your trouble." "What about the criminal charges?" I asked. "Those are separate. The district attorney is moving forward regardless of any civil settlement. I thought about it. $50,000 was a substantial amount of money, but it did not feel like enough given what I had been through. On the other hand, continuing to litigate could take months more and cost me additional attorney fees with no guarantee of a better outcome. Tell them I want $100,000, full restoration of my property including replanting trees, all attorney fees, and they have to tear down everything they have built at their own expense, I said. Jennifer relayed my counteroffer. The HOA came back at $75,000. We settled at $85,000, plus all the other terms I had requested. But I was not done with Patricia Whitmore and her cronies. The criminal case was moving forward, and I was listed as a victim and potential witness. The district attorney, a sharp woman named Laura Morrison, contacted me in September. "We have a strong case," she told me. "Whitmore is trying to claim she was misled by the others, but the evidence shows she orchestrated the whole thing. We found communications between her and the forger, financial records showing HOA funds being diverted, and testimony from other board members who say she pressured them to go along with the scheme." "What kind of sentence is she looking at?" I asked. "If convicted on all counts, she could face 5 to 10 years. The forgery and fraud charges are serious felonies." The criminal trial was scheduled for November, but before it could begin, Patricia Whitmore's attorney worked out a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges in exchange for the forgery charges being dropped. She was sentenced to 4 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution, including covering the costs of demolishing the clubhouse and restoring my property. Kenneth Fuller and Deanne Morrison received lesser sentences, 18 months and probation respectively, as they cooperated with prosecutors and testified against Whitmore. By December, the partially built clubhouse on my property was being torn down. It was satisfying to watch the excavators rip apart what they had illegally built. The HOA had hired a landscaping company to restore the land, replanting native trees and grasses. It would take years for the property to fully recover, but at least the trespass was being undone. The civil settlement money hit my bank account in early January 2027. $85,000, plus full attorney fees. It did not make up for the stress and months of my life consumed by this nightmare, but it helped. I thought about selling the property after everything that happened. The land felt tainted now, associated with fraud and legal battles rather than peaceful retirement dreams. But every time I visited and walked the trails I had cleared, I remembered why I had bought it in the first place. It was beautiful. It was mine. And I was not going to let Patricia Whitmore and her cronies take that away from me. But I still wanted some measure of satisfaction beyond just winning the legal battle. The grand opening that Patricia had been so proud to advertise was supposed to happen on September 15th. And even though construction had been stopped and she had been arrested, I could not stop thinking about that date. The idea formed slowly in my mind over those weeks of demolition and restoration. I wanted to mark that date somehow, to reclaim it from her scheme. On the morning of September 15th, I drove out to my property early. The demolition had been completed by then, and the landscaping restoration was underway. Where the clubhouse foundation had been, there was now fresh soil and newly planted saplings. I had brought a folding chair and a cooler with lunch, and I spent the day there, just sitting on my land, enjoying the peace and quiet. But the real satisfaction came from something I had planned weeks in advance. With Jennifer's help, I had filed a civil lawsuit against Patricia Whitmore personally for trespass, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The criminal case had dealt with the fraud, but I wanted to hold her accountable in civil court as well. We had calculated that her personal assets, including her house in Pinecrest and various investments, were worth close to $1 million. Jennifer had scheduled the process server to deliver the lawsuit papers to Patricia at a specific time and place. She was out on bail pending her sentencing at that point, still living in her house in Pinecrest. But Jennifer had discovered something interesting. Patricia had planned a gathering of her friends and supporters for September 15th at her house, stubbornly insisting on maintaining the original grand opening date as a defiant social event, despite everything that had happened. At exactly 6 p.m. on September 15th, while I sat on my newly restored property eating a sandwich and watching the sunset, a process server knocked on Patricia Whitmore's door. According to the process server's report that I later received, Patricia answered the door herself, dressed up and smiling, expecting another guest for her party. Instead, she was handed a summons and complaint for a civil lawsuit seeking $500,000 in damages. The process server reported that Patricia's face went white, and she started screaming at him while her guests looked on in shock from inside the house. It was not quite the same as serving papers at the actual Clubhouse grand opening like I had originally fantasized about, but it was close enough. The civil lawsuit took another year to wind through the courts. Patricia tried to fight it at first, claiming she did not have assets to pay, but Jennifer's forensic accountant found hidden bank accounts and property she had tried to conceal. Eventually, facing a trial she could not win, Patricia settled for $350,000. Combined with the criminal restitution she owed, it bankrupted her. She lost her house in Pinecrest, and her investments were liquidated to pay her debts. I took no pleasure in her financial destruction, exactly, but I felt a grim satisfaction that there were real consequences for what she had done. She had tried to steal my land through fraud and deception, and instead, she had lost everything. The Pinecrest HOA underwent massive changes in the aftermath of the scandal. Most of the board resigned, and the remaining members brought in professional management. They hired an independent auditor who discovered that Patricia had been mismanaging HOA funds for years, not just for the Clubhouse scheme but for personal expenses as well. The HOA filed its own lawsuit against her, adding to her financial woes. As for me, I finally moved forward with my plans for the property. In the spring of 2027, I hired an architect to design a small cabin for the land. Nothing elaborate, just a simple retreat where I could spend weekends and eventually retire. The architect was sensitive to what the land had been through and designed something that fit naturally into the landscape, minimizing impact on the recovering ecosystem. Construction began in June 2027, but this time it was construction I wanted, on my property, with my permission. I visited nearly every weekend to check on progress and walk the trails. The property was healing, and so was I. The cabin was completed in October 2027, just over a year after the nightmare had begun. It was perfect, a small structure with large windows overlooking the creek, a covered porch where I could sit and listen to the water, and enough space for me to be comfortable without being excessive. I invited Jennifer Coates out for dinner at the cabin once it was finished, a thank you for everything she had done. We grilled steaks on the porch and drank beer while watching the sun set through the trees. "You know, I have handled a lot of property disputes in my career," Jennifer said, "but I have never seen anything quite like your case. The audacity of what they tried to pull off is just staggering." "Do you think it happens more often than people realize?" I asked. "Probably," Jennifer said. "Most people do not check their property records regularly. If you had not shown up that day, they might have gotten away with it. By the time you noticed months later, with a completed building on the land, the legal fight would have been much harder. I still have nightmares about it sometimes, I admitted. I dream that I show up and there is a building on my land and nobody believes it is mine. That is natural, Jennifer said. What you went through was traumatic. Having someone try to steal something as fundamental as your land, your property, shakes your sense of security. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the creek and the evening sounds of the forest. Despite everything that had happened, I was glad I had fought. I was glad I had not just given up and sold the property to make the problem go away. This land was mine, and I had proven it. In November 2027, Patricia Whitmore began serving her 4-year prison sentence. I did not attend her sentencing hearing. I had spent enough time and energy on her. But I did receive a letter from the district attorney's office letting me know the outcome. Kenneth Fuller and Deanne Morrison served their time and quietly moved away from Asheville after their releases. The forger who had created the fake deed was caught and prosecuted separately, receiving a 3-year sentence. Life slowly returned to normal. I went back to focusing on my sales management job, though I was definitely closer to retirement after everything that had happened. The stress of the legal battle had aged me, and I found myself less interested in the corporate rat race and more interested in spending time at my cabin. I started going out to the property every weekend, sometimes staying for several days at a time. I cleared more trails, added a fire pit near the cabin, and built a small dock extending out over a deeper part of the creek where I could fish. The land was becoming what I had always imagined it could be, a peaceful refuge from the world. Some of the Pinecrest residents reached out to me with apologies once the full extent of Patricia's fraud became public. Many of them had been victims of her tyrannical leadership as well, dealing with arbitrary fines and rules. Under new management, the HOA became much more reasonable, focusing on actual community maintenance rather than petty enforcement and power trips. I even developed a cordial relationship with some of my Pinecrest neighbors. One couple, the Hendersons, liked to hike and asked if they could occasionally use the trails on my property. I agreed, with the stipulation that they call ahead first. I was not ready to be overly trusting, given what had happened, but I also did not want to become paranoid and isolated. In the spring of 2028, I met someone. Her name was Helen Cross, and she was a high school teacher who also loved hiking. We met on a trail in Pisgah National Forest, and she mentioned that she was looking for land to buy for a similar purpose as mine, a place to build a small retreat away from the city. I told her my story, and she was horrified but also fascinated. "I cannot believe someone would do that," she said. "Just steal your land like that." "Believe it," I said. "It happened." Helen and I started dating, and by summer, she was spending weekends at the cabin with me. She loved the property as much as I did, and she had great ideas for improving it without damaging the natural beauty. We planted a vegetable garden near the cabin and added bird feeders throughout the woods. In September 2028, exactly 2 years after Patricia's failed grand opening date, Helen and I had a small gathering at the cabin. We invited Jennifer Coates, Detective Santos, the Hendersons from Pinecrest, and a few other friends. We grilled food, played music, and celebrated life and friendship and justice. Standing on the porch of my cabin, looking out at land that was indisputably mine, surrounded by people I cared about, I felt a deep sense of peace. What Patricia Whitmore had tried to do to me had been vicious and criminal. She had tried to steal not just my land but my dreams for the future. And she had failed. The consequences had been severe for her. 4 years in prison, bankruptcy, public humiliation, and a permanent felony record. Her life was destroyed, and while I did not take pleasure in that, I did feel that justice had been served. As for me, I had my land, my cabin, my peace, and now Helen. I had proven that standing up to bullies and fighting for what is right, even when it is expensive and exhausting, is worth it. I had learned that the legal system, while slow and imperfect, can work when you have evidence and persistence. I never forgot what almost happened, though. Every time I drove up the access road to my property, I remembered that Tuesday morning when I had arrived to find construction equipment tearing up my land. Every time I walked through the clearing where the fraudulent clubhouse had been started, I remembered the anger and fear I had felt. But I also remembered the satisfaction of watching that building come down, of receiving the settlement check, of hearing that Patricia had been sentenced to prison. I remembered winning. In early 2029, I finally retired from my sales management job. I was only 56, younger than I had originally planned to retire, but the settlement money and my savings gave me the flexibility to step away. I moved into the cabin full-time, and Helen started spending more and more time there as well. We talked about getting married, about her maybe moving in permanently. She still had a few years before she could retire from teaching, but we figured out a schedule where she stayed at her apartment in Asheville during the week for work and came out to the cabin on weekends and during school breaks. Life was good. Better than good, actually. The nightmare with Patricia and the HOA had been terrible, but in a strange way, it had also been a catalyst for positive changes in my life. It had forced me to fight for what was mine, to stand up for myself in a way I had not always done in other areas of my life. It had brought me into contact with good people like Jennifer and Detective Santos, and it had indirectly led me to Helen, because if I had not been hiking so much to decompress from the stress, I might never have met her. In May 2029, Patricia Whitmore was released from prison after serving 3 years of her 4-year sentence with good behavior. I found out through a Google alert I had set up with her name. Part of me was angry that she had not served the full sentence, but honestly, by that point, I had moved on. She was no longer a threat to me. She had lost everything, and I had gained everything. I heard through the grapevine that she moved to Florida to live with a sister and was working a minimum wage job. Her real estate license had been revoked, her reputation was destroyed, and she would never hold power over anyone again. That was punishment enough. Helen and I got married in June 2029 at the cabin, a small ceremony with just close friends and family. We stood by the creek where Patricia had tried to build her fraudulent clubhouse, and we exchanged vows promising to support each other and protect what we had built together. Jennifer Coates was one of Helen's bridesmaids, having become a close friend over the years. During the reception, Jennifer pulled me aside. "You know, your case changed how I practice law," she said. "I have become much more aggressive in pursuing fraud cases. What happened to you made me realize how vulnerable property owners are to these schemes. I have taken on 3 similar cases in the past 2 years, and we have won all of them." "I am glad something good came out of it," I said. "You inspired a lot of people by fighting back," Jennifer said. "A lot of people would have just given up or tried to negotiate. You fought, and you won, and you made sure there were real consequences. That matters." As the years passed, my story became something of a legend in local real estate and legal circles. I was occasionally asked to speak at continuing legal education seminars about property fraud and the importance of diligence. I always agreed, feeling that if my experience could help even one person avoid what I went through, it was worth sharing. The property itself fully recovered over the next several years. The trees that had been planted as part of the restoration grew strong, and the scars from the construction faded. You would never know, looking at the land in 2032, that there had once been a fraudulent clubhouse foundation there. Nature had reclaimed it completely. Helen retired from teaching in 2033, and we finally became full-time residents of the cabin together. We expanded it slightly, adding a sunroom where Helen could do her painting and I could read. We adopted 2 dogs from a local shelter, mutts who loved running through the woods as much as we did. I thought about Patricia Whitmore less and less over the years. She became a cautionary tale in my mind, an example of what happens when greed and entitlement overcome ethics and legality. I hoped she had learned something from her fall, that she had become a better person, but I never reached out to find out. That chapter of my life was closed. One afternoon in the spring of 2034, I was sitting on the porch with Helen when a car pulled up. A young woman got out, looking nervous. She walked up to the porch and introduced herself as Michelle Whitmore, Patricia's daughter. "I hope I am not intruding," she said. "I wanted to talk to you if you have a few minutes." Helen and I exchanged glances. I was wary but curious. "All right," I said. "Have a seat." Michelle sat down on the porch steps. She was probably in her late 20s, with her mother's blonde hair but a much gentler face. "I wanted to apologize for what my mother did to you," she said. "I know it does not change anything, and I know I am not responsible for her actions, but I needed you to know that not everyone in my family is like her." "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "How is your mother doing?" "She is alive, working in Florida." "We do not talk much anymore," Michelle said sadly. "After everything came out, after I learned what she had done to you and to the HOA and to so many people, I could not have a relationship with her anymore. She still does not think she did anything wrong. She blames everyone else, says she was set up, says you tricked her somehow. She has learned nothing." "I am sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. Not sorry for Patricia, but sorry for Michelle, who had lost her mother to greed and delusion. "I just wanted you to know that I am sorry, and that I am glad you got your property back, and that there were consequences for what she did," Michelle said. "A lot of people who knew my mother were afraid of her. Nobody ever stood up to her before. You did, and you won, and that means something to me." Michelle left shortly after that, and I never saw or heard from her again, but the visit gave me a sense of closure I had not realized I needed. Patricia's own daughter had repudiated her actions and apologized on her behalf. It was not necessary, but it was meaningful. Helen and I lived at the cabin for many more years. We watched seasons change, storms come and go, wildlife flourish on the protected land. We hiked every trail dozens of times, and we never got tired of the beauty around us. I did eventually build something on the property, though not what Patricia had envisioned. With Helen's encouragement, I built a small art studio for her, a separate structure about 50 yards from the cabin where she could paint without interruption. It was modest, maybe 400 square feet, with big windows for natural light. We got all the proper permits, had surveys done, did everything by the book. The day the studio was completed, Helen and I stood in front of it and laughed about the irony. There was now a second building on my property, but this one was legal, wanted, and built with love rather than fraud. In 2040, when I was 67 years old and Helen was 63, we created a conservation easement on the property. It was a legal agreement that permanently protected the land from development, ensuring that even after we were gone, it would remain wild and beautiful. We worked with a local land trust to set up the easement, and it gave us peace of mind knowing that what we had fought so hard to protect would be protected forever. Looking back on everything that happened, from that shocking Tuesday morning in July 2026, when I discovered construction on my land, to the legal battles, to the arrests and trials, to building a life with Helen on the land I had saved, I realized that the experience had defined me in many ways. It had shown me that I was capable of fighting when necessary, of standing up for myself even when it was hard and expensive and exhausting. Patricia Whitmore had tried to take something precious from me, and in the process, she had lost everything while I gained more than I could have imagined. Not just the land and the settlement money, but the confidence that comes from winning a just fight, the relationships formed through adversity, and ultimately the life I had built on the property she had tried to steal. I never forgot that September 15th was supposed to be her grand opening. Every year on that date, Helen and I had a quiet celebration, just the two of us, acknowledging the day that Patricia's scheme was supposed to culminate and instead became another step in her downfall. We would make a nice dinner, open a good bottle of wine, and toast to justice and perseverance. The story spread beyond Asheville over the years. It was picked up by regional news outlets, then national ones. I was interviewed a few times, and the story always resonated with people. The idea of an HOA trying to literally steal someone's land through fraud struck a chord with everyone who had ever dealt with an overbearing HOA or felt powerless against bureaucratic systems. I always ended those interviews the same way, encouraging people to stand up for themselves, to fight when they are in the right, and to never assume that bullies and criminals will win just because they seem powerful. The legal system is imperfect, but it can work if you are persistent and have good representation. As I sit here now on my porch, writing this story and looking out at the land that is undeniably, legally, permanently mine, I feel grateful. Grateful that the conference was canceled that day in July 2026. Grateful that I showed up when I did. Grateful for Jennifer Coates and Detective Santos and everyone who helped me fight. Grateful for Helen and the life we built together. And in a strange way, grateful even for Patricia Whitmore, because fighting her taught me things about myself that I needed to learn. The clubhouse she tried to build on my land never happened, but something better did. A home, a sanctuary, a protected wilderness, and a story of justice served. That is a better legacy than any HOA clubhouse could ever be.